And as people continue to sign on, just thanks for those of you resuming back with the webinar. We did take a summer break, didn't have one in July or August. I would say here in Michigan today, it feels quite cool. Well, it feels more like fall, at least in Ann Arbor. Cloudy.
I think we can get going. It's slowing down.
Okay. Did you have any other introductory things to add, Renee?
Nope, just let everyone know as a reminder, we are recording and we post this to YouTube as well.
And Renee, thanks for all that you do to keep this flowing so smoothly.
Thank
And
you.
today, we can pull up Ben's slides. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Ben Rook. Ben is joining us for the third time. So fantastic that he's been willing to share his work with us so frequently. Ben got his undergraduate degree at the Lakes Superior State University, really great undergraduate fisheries program there, Fish and Wildlife Management. He got his master's at University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point in natural resource management, went out to the Central Valley, left the Great Lakes for a bit in California to work on salmon and habitat restoration projects for 3 years, and then came back to Michigan, worked for USGS out of the Hammond Bay Biological Station, and then shifted to work to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, where he's done a lot of work on modeling using existing data for whitefish, lake whitefish, and for Cisco. He is now working with Michigan DNR in the tribal coordination unit, working mostly on lake whitefish commercial monitoring and stock assessments. So Ben, the floor is yours, and we hope all of you will stay on for after Ben's talk for what we hope will be a friendly and interesting discussion about what he's presented here today.
All right, thanks, Bo. Can everybody see my title slide and see the laser pointer? Okay.
Looks good.
All right. So as you guys can see from the title slide, I'm going to be talking about sort of a reassessment of historical Cisco population declines in Green Bay and Saginaw Bay. And then we're also going to be providing some estimates of abundance during the late 1940s and early 1950s. So that period just prior to declines, right before everything collapsed in both areas. So I'm going to go through some background. I'm going to hit that pretty heavy just to kind of set the stage for everything. Then I'm going to go through a little bit of the methods. I'm not going to get into too many details on those, and then go through the results, which I think are a little bit more interesting for everybody. So just some background here. The Ciscos are medium-sized planktivorous pelagic fishes with a whole Arctic distribution. Members of the family, or the subfamily Corygonidae, and the genus Corygonus. They've been intensively fished for over a century in Eurasia and North America, with overharvest commonly preceding fishery collapses. And then in more densely populated areas, we see exotic species. What's that?
Are you advancing your slides?
I am not.
Okay, just making sure.
Okay.
Somebody said they couldn't see the slides, and I think most of us see it, so I'm not sure why Raina can't, but okay. Sorry about the interruption there.
Oh, no worries. And then in more densely populated areas, we have a lot of exotic species introductions and eutrophication also preceding fishery collapses. And this was especially common in Europe and then North America during the mid-1900s. And one of the things we see is that when overharvest, species introductions, and eutrophication all occurred together at about the same time, determining the root cause or causes of Cisco declines was nearly impossible. And this is mostly because the most obvious and sometimes only symptoms of population decline was basically a total fishery collapse. And determining these causes, population declines, is a precursor for successful restoration of any fish species, especially when those causes might still be operating and could impede costly and time-consuming restoration efforts. So if we take a look at the Great Lakes here, it's kind of out of order here, but I thought I'd throw the study area up so everybody has some idea of where I'm talking about, especially for some of the international audience. Historically, the largest Cisco populations in the world were found in the Laurentian Great Lakes of North America. And among these populations, Coregonus artedi comprised the shallow water Ciscos, which were the most abundant. Celts partitioned these into about 10 different subspecies, the most prominent of which he termed typical artedi. This presentation is going to focus on Cisco populations in Green Bay, Lake Michigan, which is right here, and then Saginaw Bay, Lake Huron, which is right here. And these would typically be subspecies that represented that typical artedi form. But for simplicity, we're going to use the common name Cisco throughout. In the upper Great Lakes, Cisco was the dominant zooplanktivore and an important diet item for native lake trout. Adults typically occupied offshore habitats during most of the year, but then migrated to nearshore areas to spawn during the fall. And this would be during October to December. Cisco had a low market value historically, such that the two major fisheries in the upper Great Lakes, which were these Green and Saginaw Bay spawning fisheries, depended on these massive aggregations that really made up in quantity what they lacked in price. Unfortunately, both these Cisco fisheries collapsed during the late 1950s and never recovered. At the time, researchers couldn't identify the cause of Cisco declines, but based on patterns of abundance, interactions with the newly established rainbow smelt were thought to be a major factor. More contemporary theories include overharvest, habitat degradation, primarily due to bottom hypoxia from excessive eutrophication. Interactions with alewife were also thought to be a factor historically, but some of the more recent studies have discounted this theory based on the timing of Cisco declines and then alewife expansion. Although a lot of these alewife populations that expanded and established themselves later on probably prevented some subsequent Cisco recovery. And if we take a look at data collected prior to fishery collapses, Green and Saginaw Bays contributed about 90% and then 65% to total Cisco yield in their respective lakes. If we take a look here, Green and Saginaw Bays are located about 350 kilometers apart, but we really do see some remarkably similar trends in Cisco yield in both bays during the 30-year period prior to fishery collapses. So I want to take a look at the study area a little bit closer. Historical commercial fishery data were reported by statistical district. So when we're talking about Green Bay for the rest of the presentation, we're talking about Wisconsin waters, which would be these WM1 and WM2 areas, and then Michigan waters, so MM1. So when we're talking about Green Bay combined, we're basically talking about those three statistical districts. And then when we're talking about Saginaw Bay, we're talking about MH4, which is just in Michigan waters. So if we take a look at yields for Green Bay and then Lake Michigan as a whole, we see that in Green Bay, which is this dotted line down here, we see a sharp decline followed by a recovery and then an eventual fishery collapse by the early 1960s, which occurs down here. And if we take a look at the yield for all of Lake Michigan, basically these things are interchangeable. What was coming out of Green Bay early on during that first half of the 1900s was primarily everything that was coming out of Lake Michigan, very, very high percentage of the catch. If we go and we take a look at Saginaw Bay, we see similar trends here where we see the sharp decline, but instead of a rebound or recovery, we see a stabilization, and then the fishery eventually collapses by the late 1950s. So again, pretty similar trends except for that rebound there. And again, we see that what's happening in Saginaw Bay is typically what's happening with yield in all of Lake Huron. Not quite as tied closely to lake-wide yield as Green Bay is with Lake Michigan, but again, pretty similar. So I wanted to give kind of a primer on some of the background stressors here before we get into the methods, just kind of set the stage for everyone. In these areas, we really have multiple stressors likely acting concurrently in both bays, and it's really difficult when you go through the literature to separate the effects of each of these stressors. I'm going to use Green Bay as an example to go through some of the timing, but you had very similar circumstances and timing in Saginaw Bay as well. So the following slides are going to be kind of conceptual models of the timing of how all these things are going on and how we approached it going into the project. They don't necessarily represent the relative importance of individual stressors, but it's there just to kind of give you a picture of what's going on. So the first thing I want to hit on is commercial exploitation in both areas. When you go into the literature, you see these very truncated age structures that suggest a backdrop of really heavy exploitation on Cisco in both bays, likely right up to fishery collapse. So when you take a look at the age structures, these fisheries are essentially cropping off these older, larger fish as soon as they become fully susceptible to commercial gears. So most of the historical aging structures are scales. We can kind of talk about who agrees with that and who doesn't. But the kind of the main take home message here is that 98% were age 4 or younger in Green Bay during 1948 to 1952, which is where we have scale aging data. So basically no older, larger fish whatsoever in the population. I think there are a few fish in those aging samples that maybe made it up to age 7, but vast majority are young, small fish. If we, kind of delve into Saginaw Bay a little bit here, we have aging data from the 1920s. Van Oosten, 1929, noted that age 4 fish were typically out of the population after their first year in the fishery, and only slower growing fish made it to age 5, again, based on scales. He did have some fish aged out to age 8 or 9, I believe. And then if we take a look at some of the agency data from USGS, which are archive scale samples, for Saginaw Bay anyway, during 1946 to 1948, we saw that 94% of fish in that particular fishery were age 3 or younger at spawning in Saginaw Bay. So again, very, very truncated age structures, likely heavy commercial exploitation, cropping those larger fish right off the top. Another point I wanted to hit on was this idea of rainbow smelt expansion, population decline, and then recovery. We have the best rainbow smelt data from Green Bay, but anecdotal accounts from Saginaw Bay suggest a nearly identical series of events occurred there as well. So if we take a look at the line for rainbow smelt, we see the expansion of that particular species up until about 1939 to 1940. Roughly plateaus. And then when we get to 1942 to 1943, we see a massive unexplained die-off. We then have a recovery of rainbow smelt from 1943 up until about 1950, and then they persist at a relatively high level of abundance thereafter. And if you take a look at trends in Cisco yield in Green Bay, you see that there's some pretty remarkable trends that show up there well. And a lot of the literature at the time focused on this rainbow smelt die-off followed by a Cisco recovery. So we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper with some of the analysis too. Third thing I wanted to hit on was this idea of widespread hypoxia and then hexagenia disappearances in both bays. So basically when we get into the mid 1900s in these bays, they're becoming very, very hypereutrophic. And then we have some very low bottom dissolved oxygen levels. And we have some pretty limited dissolved oxygen sampling. So some of the best evidence of widespread bottom hypoxia comes from hexagenia presence and absence data. The evidence suggests a nearly identical series of events with hypoxic conditions possibly occurring slightly earlier in Green Bay than in Saginaw Bay. Green Bay, we have hypoxic overwinter conditions first observed in the lower bay in 1938. Hexagenia was still abundant at that particular time. Between 1938 and 1952, hexagenia was declining in the lower bay, and then it was rare when it was sampled in 1952 and absent after 1955. And then if you look at the historical accounts, we have widespread overwinter hypoxia throughout, the vast majority of the lower bay by the mid 1960s. I mentioned in Saginaw Bay, we had a similar series of events. Sampling's kind of sporadic too, but by 1955 to 1956, we had a major hexagenia decline in the inner bay, and this was likely related to a severe hypoxia event. And then between 1956 and 1965, hexagenia was declining in the inner bay. It was rare when sampled in 1965 and then assumed extirpated thereafter. So if we take a look at everything that's going on in both bays, again, I have Green Bay up here, but really the same kind of things going on in Saginaw Bay. We have this perfect storm of multiple stressors acting against these Cisco populations in both bays by the mid 1950s. So this brings us to our objectives, which were to use historical data and literature sources to evaluate the relative importance and effects of overfishing interactions with rainbow smelt and bottom hypoxia on Cisco populations in both Green Bay and Saginaw Bay during the periods immediately preceding fishery collapses. Basically, what we want to do is go in and evaluate available historical data to see if we can tease apart potential causes of Cisco population declines in each bay. And there's a lot going on here, which is why I kind of laid out some of the things we're going to be looking at ahead of time here. So I thought it would be good just to give kind of a general overview of the methods before we dive into each individual section. So for looking at commercial fishing, we're going to be using stochastic or random age structured simulation models. These are going to be building on some of the things we did in Lake Superior previously. We're going to look at those for both Green and Saginaw bays. We're looking at the potential effects of rainbow smelt. We're going to be using correlation analyses for Green Bay only. One of the problems we ran into with Saginaw Bay is that the rainbow smelt fishery never really fully developed. So the data for Green Bay is much better there, even though we have these anecdotal accounts that basically the same thing was happening. And then for hypoxia and hexagenia, we're doing pretty comprehensive literature review and then sort of lining up timing of Cisco declines with when we think hypoxia and hexagenia declines were a problem in each of these areas. And we're doing that for both bays. So for our simulation models, we're going to be estimating commercial exploitation rates, and then they're going to provide probability of collapse and then time to collapse under different exploitation rates. And then they're also going to give us numbers of adult and age 1 fish. So for those people looking to restore Cisco populations in any of these areas, these could be used as kind of a benchmark here. For correlation analyses, we're pairing Cisco catch per effort with yield of rainbow smelt 3 years earlier. So we're looking at interactions between adult rainbow smelt and then larval or age 0 Cisco. So these would be indicators of potential competition or predation. Can't really establish a cause and effect here, but you would expect to see some negative interactions there, negative correlations if there were anything going on. And then with the literature review, again, sporadic sampling, but we can get a general idea of timing of hypoxic conditions for both bays as well. So I thought I'd start out by going through the modeling periods. We had data for simulation modeling available for 1945 to 1957 for Green Bay. These are coming from published studies and agency records. So we have things like weight, length, and scale ages, maturity, and then monthly harvest by gear. We chose to select a 1.0 million kilogram per year yield used to define the cutoff years for modeling. So we have a relatively high level of abundance, pretty consistent fishery going on there for nearly a decade. If we take a look at this, the modeling period is likely similar to or slightly increased in Cisco abundance compared to the early 1900s. Same kind of situation with Saginaw Bay. We have data for simulation modeling available for 1944 to 1954. These are coming from agency records, which include length, weight, scale ages, maturity, and then monthly harvest by gear. And then for Saginaw Bay, we're using a 250,000 kilogram per year yield to define our cutoff years. And then if we take a look at this, we're likely either dealing with reduced fishery capacity. So in Saginaw Bay, we had a lot of fishery attrition where people were leaving. So those particular fisheries may not be able to process what they could have in the past. Or we're looking at decreased Cisco abundance compared to the early 1900s. So a little bit reduced here, kind of a little bit different situation going on in Saginaw Bay than what we have in Green Bay. So I want to go over some of the data sources here. Smith, 1956, which is this life history of lake herring of Green Bay, Lake Michigan. Pretty comprehensive study, has just about everything you could ever want on Cisco in Green Bay at that particular time. We're also using data from Cal et al. 2022. So this is a data release from USGS where we went back and we entered paper records for each month. And then we also went back and found some scale archives, so where we have aging structures for a lot of the commercial harvest in Saginaw Bay. Van Oosten, 1947, kind of leaned heavily on this as sort of a guide for what was going on with rainbow smelt populations and Cisco populations, pre and post 1942-43 die-off. And then we have a variety of various other publications related to sort of dissolved oxygen and then hypoxia and hexagenia monitoring. So there's a few of those. I don't have any of them up here, but multiple publications there. My pointer's not working quite right. So I'll kind of go into model structure a little bit here. I'm just going to kind of give a brief overview of it. But basically, we're using stochastic age-structured simulation models. You can kind of think of age classes running from age 1 to 15 across the top, and then simulation years running from 1 to 200 down the side. And then we're going to go ahead and use historical data from published studies and agency records to populate this internal matrix here. There's going to be a stochastic component throughout, so we're accounting for random variability as much as possible. So for this particular Green Bay example, we're using scale ages from Smith 1956 to populate our initial age structure and abundance. And again, 98% of those fish were age 4 at younger at spawning, so we didn't really do any corrections there. And then the oldest individual was age 7. Once we have our initial age structure and abundance, we need to go ahead and estimate our age structure and abundance the following year. And this is typically, going to be the mortality equation you'll see just about anywhere, where we're taking and estimating age structure and abundance in the following year from age structure and abundance in the previous year. We're just applying natural mortality, and then we're applying fishing mortality. So for our natural mortality estimator, we're using Poly 1980. For our fishing mortality, we're using catch curve analysis to estimate total mortality and then getting our fishing mortality by subtracting natural mortality. And then I've got a simplified equation up here, but we also have selectivity for a variety of different fisheries with different mesh sizes and gears. So we're incorporating selectivity into these estimates as well. Once we have our age structure and abundance the following year, we need some sort of measure of recruitment. So for this one, we're using the Ricker-Stock recruit relationship. And in this particular case, we're predicting age 1 recruits from age 2 plus abundance 2 years earlier. So our alpha parameter is just recruits per spawner at low spawning stock size. Our beta parameter is the rate of compensatory density dependence. And then we just have a multiplicative error term here. So I want to mention we use the notation Nij equals 2 plus for adult abundance. This is a little bit different than what everybody's probably going to be used to seeing for Cisco. If you're working in Lake Superior, this would typically be age 3 plus. For these particular populations, we're assuming 18% of age 2, 99% of age 3, and then 100% of age 4 to 15 fish were mature. And this is based on maturity data from the literature or agency records, and then length or size at age. For model calibrations, we use parameter estimates from historical Cisco and Wisconsin waters of Lake Superior from a previous study we conducted for our initial inputs. And then we calibrated models by systematically adjusting alpha, beta, and epsilon until simulated yields mimicked observed yields. So we're calibrating to the mean and then the standard deviation. And then we have 1,000 sets of estimates for 150 years that we're using for calibrations. So when I talk about yield, we're basically estimating our catch using the Baranoff catch equation, which is a pretty standard form you'll see here. Basically just incorporates fishing mortality and natural mortality and then applies that to numbers of individuals at a given age in the population in a given year. I mentioned this is kind of a simplified overview of everything. We had natural mortality, which was assumed to operate throughout the entire year in conjunction with commercial fisheries, so January through December. And then we also included 4 competing commercial fisheries based on season and gear. So seasons were this non-spawn fishery, which was January through September, and then the spawn fishery, which was October through December. And then different gears for Green Bay, we had small mesh gill nets, and then we had small mesh pound nets, I believe, in Green Bay. Both of those were operated throughout the course of the year. So we do have that non-spawn and then spawn fishery. Individuals removed to natural mortality were not available to commercial fisheries. And then we assumed individuals removed during the non-spawn period were not available during the spawn period. So we're kind of accounting for how these different fisheries interact. One simulation was 1,000 iterations for 200 years. Years 1 to 50 were used as a burn-in period. And then the models tracked recruitment, adult stock size, and yield in years 51 to 200. Then we use these models to estimate probability of collapse and then time to collapse under different exploitation rates. And when we're looking at collapse, we're defining that as a 90% decline in adult stock size, which is pretty similar to what we saw for historical decline. So it's kind of a worst case scenario. Our likelihood of collapse is the proportion of iterations with a collapse. And then our time to collapse was just the median years to collapse among our 1,000 iterations. And then we completed this exercise for both bays. So some model assumptions, I think it's important to go over those based on snapshots in time. So Green Bay, we're basically just looking at 1945 to 1957. Saginaw Bay, we're looking at 1944 to 1954. And the models also assume that these previously observed commercial fishery characteristics and recruitment dynamics accurately represent future conditions. So we're assuming these average conditions during 45 to 57 or 44 to 54 are going to persist out into the future when we look at sustainability. Now, we know this isn't the case because we do see that bottom hypoxia and interactions with exotic species such as alewife expansion likely worsened in both of these areas for the next 10 to 20 years. So this is kind of a situation where had these changes not occurred, this is what we think would have happened. So for correlation analyses, as I mentioned before, we're only conducting those for Green Bay. We're using Spearman rank order correlations, and then we're pairing Cisco catch per effort in state of Michigan waters of Green Bay with lake-wide yield of rainbow smelt 3 years earlier. For Cisco, we're using gill and pound net CPE from 1934 to 1960. And then for rainbow smelt, we're using total yield from all gears from 1931 to 1957. So I just want to mention that the years used for analyses correspond to the 3-decade period between rainbow smelt invasion, which really began in 1931, and then Cisco fishery collapse, which occurred in 1960. And then we're offsetting these with a 3-year lag to account for potential interactions between adult rainbow smelt and then larval or age 0 Cisco. We use a model-wide p-value of 0.05 with a Bonferroni correction to test for significance. So basically just, making sure we account for the total number of pairwise comparisons. We only use 2, so not really a big deal. I want to mention that we use CPEs from state of Michigan waters because this allowed for use of a much longer time series. The data for Wisconsin was much more limited, but really did correlate well with what we saw in Michigan waters. Then we used the lake-wide yield of rainbow smelt because it also allowed for much wider time series. And nearly all rainbow smelt harvested in Lake Michigan during that time period were coming from Green Bay. So no real concerns there on our end. For our literature review, we're conducting this for both bays, and we're comparing years of irreversible Cisco population declines with available records of hypoxia and hexagenia presence and absence. Again, sporadic sampling, but can get a general idea of timing for both bays. Then we're asking the question, did widespread hypoxia and hexagenia disappearances occur within about 3 years of irreversible Cisco population declines? So we're defining our years of irreversible population declines based on yields falling below 10% of average values for all preceding years with no meaningful recovery. And then I just want to point out that 3 years is roughly 1 generation in these heavily fished Cisco populations. So that's about all the longer they stay in the system. So I just want to throw some caution out as far as the Saginaw Bay modeling goes. Although we report what we consider to be the best fit results, model evaluations did suggest that overall performance of the Green Bay model was good, whereas overall performance of the Saginaw Bay model was poor. So I just want you guys to exercise some caution when we go through the results and interpret those. So one of the things we saw here is that recruitment of age 1 Cisco could be modeled basically independent of adult stock size in Saginaw Bay. Which is pretty consistent with reduced levels of abundance. And this is one of those situations where when you try and go and model these things, it generally leads to, stock productivity being overestimated. So as that cascades through, we're probably going to be underestimating our probability of collapse at higher exploitation rates because we're overestimating how productive the stock is. So it's generally, kind of on that right side of the Ricker curve where it's kicking out lots and lots of recruits, but that's also the point where you get into trouble. General impression is that the Green Bay Cisco population was likely stable and near historical high levels of abundance during the modeling period, whereas the Saginaw Bay Cisco population was likely undergoing some changes and potentially at a reduced level of abundance. I also mentioned earlier that we had some reduced fishery capacity there, which also could have impacted our modeling results for Saginaw Bay. So one of the things you want to see in these models when you're calibrating the yield is that yield is actually sort of indicative of true abundance there. And if you go in and look at some of the catch per effort values for Saginaw Bay, that may not necessarily be the case. It may be a situation where the fishery is basically capped out based on what it can process, and it may not actually be tracking what's available for abundance, which is actually pretty different compared to most of the Cisco fisheries you see. Most of the abundance or most of the yield estimates are pretty consistent with catch per effort. On Saginaw Bay, that's not necessarily the case. So I'll get into some results here. This is typically of what you'd see of figures displaying some Ricker stock recruit curves. We've got spawners, millions of fish for each area along the x-axis. And then we've got age 1 recruits, millions of fish along the y-axis. Green Bay is right up here. Saginaw Bay is down here. Then these gray plus signs represent approximate 150-year average model estimates of adult and age 1 abundance preceding spawn fisheries. So if we dive into the actual numbers here, model estimates suggested that the adult population was about 6.5-fold larger in Green Bay than in Saginaw Bay during the historical modeling periods. And model estimates also suggested about 5-fold greater density dependence in Saginaw Bay than in Green Bay. In Green Bay, we're really operating on this density dependent right side of the Ricker curve. Age 1 recruitment would be expected to have, some sort of relationship with adult abundance through density dependent processes. And we have median adult estimates of 56.6 million fish and median age 1 estimates of 69.7 million fish. On Saginaw Bay, we're sort of sloping down into this density independent or left side of the Ricker curve, so it's not particularly well behaved. Age 1 recruitment would be expected to be largely independent of adult abundance. And then we have median estimates of 8.5 million adults and then 21.4 million age 1 recruits for those particular areas. If we take a look at figures displaying probability of collapse along this top row and then median years to collapse along the bottom row, we have Green Bay on the column or on the left column and then Saginaw Bay on the right column. And then we have exploitation rate along the x-axis. So I just want to mention again, collapse was defined as a 90% reduction in median adult abundance under calibration conditions. So average conditions during the historical modeling period. And then when I'm talking about exploitation rates in these particular figures, that's going to correspond to the number of adults harvested out of the total number of adults available for all age groups. So these include younger, smaller individuals that aren't fully recruited to commercial fishing gears yet. And then the dashed vertical lines you see right here, and then right here, and then in the same places in the bottom panels, indicate average exploitation rates estimated based on the historical commercial fishery data. So if we take a look at these, we see that probability of collapse was generally low, and time to collapse was generally high at exploitation rates less than about 0.15, which is right here for Green Bay, and then 0.5, which is right here for Saginaw Bay. And again, probably overestimating how productive these stocks are for Saginaw Bay. It's just kind of the impression you get when you get into things and start looking at some of the model diagnostics and that sort of thing. Estimated exploitation rates were 0.23 for Green Bay and then 0.40 for Saginaw Bay under historical calibration conditions. And then we see that, kind of the impression looking at model diagnostics and that sort of thing, probably the sustainability results for Green Bay are more realistic for what was actually going on. And exploitation rate should have been maintained below about 0.15 in both bays to promote sustainability and prevent overharvest. And I also want to point out what fully selected exploitation rates were in both of these areas because they were extremely high. In Green Bay, it was 0.84. and then in Saginaw Bay, it was 0.82. So with exploitation rates that high, these fish were basically completely removed from the populations almost immediately after reaching age 4. And that's kind of, where things are at. So extremely, extremely heavy commercial fishing pressure. I thought it would be useful to look at the data used for rank order correlations in Green Bay rather than just jumping into correlation plots. When we look at these, we see what looks like fishery switching going on maybe right here, and then right here and right here between Cisco and rainbow smelt. But the historical literature accounts make it pretty clear that this was not the case in Green Bay, and the trends represent actual changes in abundance of each species. So when we went through and did the analysis, we're looking at Cisco gillnet CPE versus rainbow smelt yield, and then Cisco pound net CPE versus rainbow smelt yield. And I want to point out that gillnets index slightly older, larger Cisco than what the pound nets do. Those are going to be slightly younger, smaller segment of the population. And what we see are these similar trends, but we do see some slight differences based on which index of Cisco abundance we use. And again, we don't have good rainbow smelt data for Saginaw Bay, but if you look at the historical accounts, they strongly suggest a pretty similar pattern of events. So I just kind of want to point these out here. Very, very stark contrast here between when rainbow smelt are increasing, when they have their die off, and how Cisco respond to that. And it gets picked up in both gears. It's just a little bit different depending on what age classes and what size classes you're indexing based on these gears. So if we dive into what these rank order correlations look like, very strong. So basically getting a strong negative correlation between Cisco catch per effort, regardless of the gear you use. It's a little bit stronger in gill nets than pound nets. And then when you look at rainbow smelt yield, the higher the rainbow smelt yield you get, the more your gill net CPE and your pound net CPE of Cisco goes down. Both correlations were significant based on the Bonferroni corrections. And again, just to point out, can't establish a cause and effect, but negative correlations would be expected if adult rainbow smelt negatively affected Cisco abundances in some way. So this does suggest some kind of negative interaction between adult rainbow smelt and Cisco during the larval or age 0 stage. I'll throw out predation or competition, and I'm sure there will be a healthy discussion about that at some point. If we jump into our literature review and what we found there, we see years of irreversible Cisco population declines occurring in 1960 in Green Bay and then 1956 in Saginaw Bay. And these would correspond to the 1956 Cisco year class in Green Bay and then the 1952 year class in Saginaw Bay. If we take a look at when hexagenia are rare to absent, Green Bay, this occurred after 1952 to 1955. Kind of hard to put an exact date on there based on what we have available. And then in Saginaw Bay, after 1955 to 1956, people are very clear about this date break in Saginaw Bay. It was something that was noted by multiple authors there. And then we see these widespread accounts of hypoxia in both bays by the mid-1960s. So based on year class, years of irreversible Cisco population declines line up reasonably well with hexagenia disappearances in both bays. And it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the sampling was sporadic, so these dates aren't really exact. And then I'll just suggest that hypoxia was likely present over a very wide area of both bays by the 1960s. So late 1950s, early 1960s, these areas are turning into pretty good cesspools, if you will. So visually, this is kind of what it looks like for Green Bay. So I've got Cisco yield on the x-axis, and then we've got year on the y-axis. So our last year class before declines occurred in 1956, which is this dashed vertical line here. And then we have our first occurrence of severe hypoxia, or at least as best we can estimate it, from 1952 to 1956, which is right here. So given how accurate we are on our year ranges, fairly close agreement right here. If we take a look at the same figure for Saginaw Bay, Our last year class before declines was 1952, which is the dashed vertical line. And then our first occurrence of severe hypoxia was sort of this 1955, 1956 range. And again, we're within about a Cisco generation of when we first started seeing these things. So fairly good agreement here as well, given, you know, how accurate we can actually look at those in the literature. So just kind of in summary, Green and Saginaw Bays were an absolute mess by the mid 1950s. I don't think that's a shock to anyone. They sort of had a perfect storm of multiple stressors acting against Cisco population in both bays. And it was difficult to separate out the effects of individual stressors even after going through this exercise. So one of the things we see is that, you know, any one of these probably could have led to population collapse, but the fact that you have all of these acting in conjunction, it's pretty much guaranteed to happen. Productive systems allowed Cisco to support relatively high exploitation rates to a point. If you look at the simulation model outputs, I suspect both populations were likely being fished either above or near peak levels for the vast majority of the modeling period. Rainbow smelt and widespread hypoxia likely reduced productivity of Cisco stocks in both bays, eventually leading to fishery collapse. So you got this high level of background fishing going on, then you're adding rainbow smelt, then you're adding hypoxia. This is mostly going to affect eggs and hatching. And then rainbow smelt presumably is going to be predation on larvae or competition, leading to reduced fitness and less, lower survival. And then conditions in both bays likely worsen for at least the next 10 to 20 years. If you look at some of the literature, you've got alewives coming on the scene and becoming extremely prevalent, and then the conditions in the bays as far as eutrophication are actually getting worse. So once these stocks collapsed, I think conditions in these bays probably prevented any sort of subsequent recovery, even in the absence of commercial fishing. And with that, funding was provided by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and then additional support was provided by USGS at the Great Lakes Science Center in Ann Arbor. And I will take any questions if you guys have any.
Okay, thanks very much, Ben. Great talk. Kind of paint a very bleak picture there of what it was like in those bays in the 50s and 60s with one hammer after another on those Cisco populations. Nice job of assembling different lines of evidence in different ways, from the complex sort of population stochastic model to the correlation, and then just the sort of the literature review, trying to pull together the hypoxia through hexagenia as best you could. So we've got, I forgot to ask you how much time you had, Ben, but hopefully you've got at least 15 minutes, if not more, for questions.
Yeah, I'm good with whatever. So
okay, we have a good tradition here of having friendly discussion, and the best way to do that is through either raising your hand or popping your camera on, or you can also use the chat, which I see we already have 2 questions on there. We'll start with one from Titus. What did the rest of the commercial fishery catch look like in the bays during these time periods? And why were they focusing on Cisco, do you think?
Yeah, so a lot of the focus on Cisco, or a lot of the focus shifted to Cisco as other more desirable species were kind of being removed from the system and weren't there anymore. So especially in Saginaw Bay, when I mentioned fishery attrition before, you sort of have this situation where the entire bay is dying at this point in time. It's just kind of starting. And then as you get further and further along through the 50s and then into the 60s, commercial catches of everything are just tanking. And then eventually, you don't have anything to go after. In Green Bay, as Cisco declined, they were still fishing for rainbow smelt. That was a pretty developed fishery there. And then as they kind of increased in abundance, they still continue to pursue those. But I mean, it's one of those situations where everything was in pretty bad shape by the time you got to this period, and things started declining. So it's pretty bleak.
Sarah Woody has a question. What do you think, or what was the main impact of increased rainbow smelt on Cisco? Competition, question mark, and you sort of anticipated this question.
Yeah, it really depends on where you go. I think there's some areas where you have a high spatial overlap between adult rainbow smelt and larval Cisco. I think predation's a big factor in those cases. And then you also have some other situations where maybe you have some rainbow smelt that are hatching where you do have competition at the larval stage, or maybe some, subadult rainbow smelt or decreasing available zooplankton for larval Cisco when they do get to that stage. But in general, I mean, there's evidence. I think there's probably more evidence for predation, but there's probably sufficient evidence for both if you were to look in the right situation. I think it's all situational, and especially in Green Bay, you have this enclosed, confined space where potentially these larvae are going to overlap with rainbow smelt as they're coming in and coming off the spawn in the spring too. So
I mean, it's certainly the case that there can be coexistence if we look today, places like North Channel or even Lake Superior, but I think they're all, even in those places, like Jared Meyer's work in Lake Superior, for example, there are clear negative effects. And maybe the densities in Green Bay at this time were just, I mean, I guess that's a question. Is there any way to sort of compare the densities from that commercial fishery and sort of get a sense of how dense the smelt were in the 50s?
it was a
What we have
lot. They,
today.
they were very dense.
Mm-hmm.
They're way more than what we see today.
Okay.
But I don't have any number I can put on it, but just my general memory of it is, they were quite abundant at that particular point in time. Because this was right when they were coming on the scene and they didn't have anything really slowing them down because there wasn't any lake trout population there to suppress them.
Yeah. So while we wait for other questions, I have a sort of a technical question about the model itself. Um, Models have all kinds of assumptions, and you laid some of those out. And so you had natural mortality through poly, which is very reasonable, but essentially natural mortality isn't changing through time, right? It's set throughout this time period. Whereas if we think about these other factors like rainbow smelt or hypoxia, that could be affecting that natural mortality rate and not sort of the fishery itself. So I'm just wondering if you could use the evidence of your model where what you came up with was something like a 15% exploitation rate would be what you'd have to sort of maintain to be sustainable. And then your model sort of estimating a much, much higher exploitation rate. Can you help me understand if that could be evidence for the fishery alone just causing the collapse without these additional factors?
Yeah, I
Can the
think that's
model be used
very
that
much a
way?
possibility. So
Yeah.
if we go, let me go back a couple slides here if I can get my pointer going. So basically, if we take a look at Green Bay, we're actually above what I would consider sustainable there as far as model outputs go. And then if we look at Saginaw Bay, we were below that. I suspect we are severely overestimating productivity of the Saginaw Bay stock, just based on everything that was going on then and where the population was at that particular point in time. I think 0.15 is probably accurate, but we were actually fishing them at 0.23. And then again, when we're estimating this 0.23 number, that's sort of an average over the entire time period based on what we have for ages and CPEs of those individual ages. So that would be kind of an average. So earlier on in the time period, it could be a little lower than that. And then later on in the time period, you could be getting a little bit higher than that. So, maybe for the first half of that particular modeling period, it was below that 0.15 mark. And then as you get to the second half of that time period, it's well above that to the point where it could drive them down to collapse. So again, this is just kind of an average over that entire time period. If that makes that makes sense.
Yeah. Did I hear you, like I wrote down like 0.84 exploitation rate in Green Bay? Where?
Yeah. So if you look at some of the selectivity curves for these gears, really the only thing keeping these fisheries going is the fact that age 3 fish aren't fully selected. When you get to age 4, they're pretty much fully selected and they're out of there as soon as they run into a fishing net. So they basically have age 3 individuals and then a few age 2 individuals that spawn. And then whatever makes it to age 4 is just out of there as soon as they run into the fishery.
few more in the chat here. Robin DeBruni, thinking about Lake Erie, Cisco, which was another one that maybe you thought about including, but you had enough on your plate. Have you compared these results with what sort of has happened in Lake Erie to see if the patterns line up?
I have not.
Earlier. Yeah, but
I have not. There's actually archive scale samples in there with ages for a few areas in Canadian waters and stuff like that. If somebody wanted to look at that at some point, there's the potential to do that too. It was just not something we got to.
Yeah, she notes the crash was earlier, but as many of the components you had, plus the habitat, not just from hypoxia, but just from spawning habitat loss in places like the Detroit River, of course. So Owen Gorman providing another Lake Superior, also showing a steep collapse in Cisco stocks after the 1950s and rainbow smelt taking off afterwards. Hypoxia not being an issue in Lake Superior, he's saying. So he's wondering about the effect of apex predators, lake trout, which they published on, or he's published on in Lake Superior as being a key part of that.
Yeah, and one of the things you see in these two areas is there's basically no apex predators once rainbow smelt get in there. I mean, all the lake trout are gone. We hadn't started stocking salmon yet. So this was a situation where, rainbow smelt were primed to do very well and go above and beyond what they probably would have been able to do had you had a lot of lake trout still remaining in the system and they had not been fished out and not killed off by sea lamprey at this point.
Let's see, am I missing? I don't see any hands being raised. Taylor, thanks for jumping on.
Yeah, I'll bite. So, Ben, this probably won't come as a surprise, but I've been also thinking about how these factors might have been affecting whitefish, lake whitefish specifically. And I looked at some of the commercial records, and it looks like lake whitefish had a similar spike and decline at about the same time, looking at lakewide records. So not for Green Bay, just what I could find quickly. And so I'm wondering, at some point, whitefish came back in Green Bay. Cisco have not. What do you think about that in terms of some of the factors that you've talked about that have been remediated in some way for, things like bottom hypoxia? Yeah, I've just been thinking about that. Don't have a super formulated question, but perhaps thought invoking.
Yeah, I think there's something different about their life history strategy that allows them to sort of sidestep those sorts of things. And you also have a situation with whitefish where they were never reduced to the levels that Cisco were reduced to. So Cisco were essentially extirpated from both of these areas. And then pretty much the entire, the vast majority of Lake Michigan and the vast majority of Lake Huron too. So maybe a recolonization issue and then something early life history related that allows them to maybe sidestep some of these things too.
Scott Hansen dropped a plot of whitefish harvests lake-wide. I mean, they do bottom out a little bit later, looks like. And there must have been enough to hang on. And of course, one of the potential mechanisms of recovery for whitefish was the sea lamprey control. But I agree with you in terms of like, there must have been enough whitefish around to recolonize these areas, much more so than say the Cisco, which are now moving to recolonize areas. And maybe they will recolonize Green Bay as the conditions have improved, as the whitefish have sort of taken advantage of that. I mean, any thoughts on sort of Cisco recolonization today in Green Bay?
Um, I think there's probably still some hypoxia issues. But other than that, I mean, I don't think there would be anything that would really prevent them. Historically, they would have spawned all around those peninsulas and around Green Bay. So I mean, there's ample areas they could go to. It's kind of figuring out that recruitment question, as far as whether they'd be able to actually hold on once you establish the population there. And I think the thing with whitefish too is, at least recently, they've shown, if you look at Cisco and Lake Superior, and then you look at whitefish and Lake Superior, whitefish are showing, much more consistent recruitment. That same goes for northern Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, at least prior to everything going on right now, much more consistent. So you didn't necessarily have to hit the lottery for whitefish to recolonize an area. They'd probably slowly build up and do that on their own. Whereas Cisco, maybe after these, massive collapses, you did have to hit the lottery to actually make that possible. Just a thought I had.
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know if that'll trigger anything for Taylor. I saw Marianne Evans had her hand up.
You sort of asked my question in the meantime, Bo.
Oh, okay.
But it was just, Ben, you prefaced this as examining what happened in the 50s to see if those problems were still problems now, and talk about the potential for restoration efforts given that situation. But both sort of touched on some of that, but would you like to elaborate any more on what do your findings mean for current restoration efforts?
Yeah, so rainbow smelt are pretty much greatly reduced compared to what they were in the 50s and 60s. So kind of in much better shape there. I'd say alewives probably in much better shape there. I mean, we didn't really look at alewives, but those came onto the scene a little bit later and were probably detrimental to Cisco actually recovering after they crashed. We do have some hypoxia left in Saginaw Bay and probably some in Green Bay as well. But again, it's in much better shape than it used to be. So I think it's one of those situations where we can throw some fish in and see what happens. I don't think there's any harm in that. And then there's also these sort of kind of the ratio effect. So what is the size of rainbow smelt compared to Cisco? What is the size of alewives compared to Cisco populations? I think there's probably some sort of a certain threshold that these populations have to meet to kind of get beyond these competition or predation bottlenecks, if that's actually what's going on. And we may not have reached those yet. So again, kind of like, optimistic. But there's also, some of these things that we think were occurring historically are also still going on now. And then sort of another positive thing is we don't have commercial fisheries targeting these things in Green Bay or Saginaw Bay right now, so we don't have to worry about that as of yet.
Yeah, great question, Marianne. Thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, I don't know if you wanted to comment upon the ongoing Cisco restoration efforts in Saginaw Bay, or if anybody else on the call would like to.
I think it will be very interesting to see what happens. And, I think we're going to get some very good information out of it regardless. So that'll be very cool.
Yeah.
I'm optimistic anyway.
I mean, I don't see anybody flipping their camera on, and I'm not firsthand, in charge of the evaluation in any way. So I don't know if anybody from the Alpena Fish and Wildlife Office might want to. Jose.
Yes, I'm here. Do you hear
Yes. Why don't you talk about sort of what's going on with Cisco restoration in Saginaw Bay today?
Well, yes, Fish and Wildlife Service have been stocking Cisco in Saginaw Bay for the last since 2017, and we are over 5 million fingerling stocking already. Last year we found our first return in Saginaw Bay, 44 returns positive for have been marked. So until now we're heading in the right direction for restoration.
Yeah, so some good survival of some of the stocked fish, and looking now for evidence of natural reproduction. I think some of the larvae that you all caught this year will be sort of assessed to see if they're whitefish or hopefully Cisco. So it is encouraging. Titus asked, I think sort of tongue-in-cheek, about the potential to stock. Doesn't anyone have a couple 100,000 little Cisco to stock in Green Bay? So it's definitely a management question that's not part of my job description to answer. Yeah. Chuck, question.
Yeah, just to comment on Titus's comment. So right now the service is at capacity to serve up what formal requests from the lake committees are. So I guess the answer is, all the brick and mortar and the water is already being allocated. My only other comment would be if conditions are ripe in Green Bay, we would not want to do a couple 100,000. We'll have to get to, 1 million plus or more. That's the serious effort we're going to have to make. So I think a couple 100,000 is just not going to do it.
That's based on predation, you think, Chuck?
I think it's based on not enough fish to get anything going. Just looking at what's going on in Lake Ontario. I mean, there's very few fish going in there every year. So, and I know they've documented poor post-release survival and other things, but that we hope we can overcome those. Mm-hmm. But I think this is a numbers game.
Hey, we got a fishery manager to comment on this question.
Yeah, you dragged me in there, Bo. And Chuck, I couldn't help it. But hello, everybody. Randy Claremont, Michigan DNR Fisheries Division. And Ben, I'll have to look forward to the recording because I got pulled off right when your webinar started. So I missed the majority of what you said. What I did want to jump in, I'll first second what Chuck just said about the numbers. And really, if we're going to take adaptive management strategies, we have to be able to evaluate them. So I'm very happy to see the data being collected by the Alpena Fish and Wildlife Service, following up those stocking evaluations. And I think a minimum fish really was the minimum or 1 million fish was the minimum by which I felt comfortable we would be able to even measure an effect. So that's fascinating. And teasing out both spring versus fall stockings, site fidelity, all those will be very important. One of the contexts that I want to draw everyone to, which was just discussed, is this idea. There's two kind of, I don't want to call them myths, but certainly there are suggestions in the context of Cisco restoration that cause managers a little bit of discomfort. And the first is this idea when we were talking about Cisco reintroduction of an open niche. These lakes have a lot of species that interact in very changing and dynamic food webs. So the idea that there's an open niche that this native fish could be restored to, I think, is a misnomer, because they're going to face different stresses. They're going to face different levels of competition, from introduced salmonines to other invasive species, non-desirable non-natives. So that's kind of the first one I just caution. The second one is, and Ben, maybe this is where I need to circle back and look at your model and your data a little bit more, but the idea that the Cisco historically that lived in these systems will equate into our ability to measure restoration success going forward. I think if you look at even the competitors like Rainbow Smelt, their recruitment dynamics went through selection pressures whereby they've now adapted. We've seen it in Pacific salmonines where wild coho run in November, where a stock coho run in August. These animals go through these adaptive traits even over a few decades that make these historical conditions cautionary to say they're going to apply directly to either the Cisco that are currently in the lakes or our ability to promote recovery. And that's why I do agree with the overall conclusion. The Saginaw Bay reintroduction is critical to us to be able to tease out, not only the effort, the numbers, the logistics, but also from a food web standpoint, how are they reacting to the changes of Lake Huron today, given it's vastly different than what it ever was, and was even during the time when Cisco were either abundant or declining in the 50s. So there's your management bit, Bo. I hope
that's great.
Drop the mic there.
There's many, other lines of evidence of the Cisco in Lake Michigan today, that they are acting differently, growing faster, eating different things, adapting to the food web. So yeah, point well taken. And Ben, I don't know if you wanted to sort of comment at all about sort of the relevancy of, I think Randy was sort of getting at, to what extent can we, it's one thing, your work did a really nice job of looking for different levels of evidence for exploitation versus smelt versus hypoxia in terms of causing these collapses in these two important embayments. And then I think Randy's trying to get at, to what extent can we take that information and use it in a very different sort of food web that exists today from a restoration context.
Yeah, and I think it would be kind of a good starting point to say, okay, what do we need to look at as we're trying to put Cisco into Saginaw Bay and restore the species there? These are a few things that we think were an issue historically. Let's make sure we look at them and evaluate those as we're going through this process for Saginaw Bay currently. And sort of on the numbers of fish too, when you look at the literature here, you get the impression that these systems were just primed to have these massive populations of Cisco at this particular point in time. I think you're, in those early 1950s, before things declined, you're sort of right at that precipice where eutrophication was coming onto the scene, and you probably had some pretty consistent, stable recruitment, but you were right at that tipping point where just a little push was going to push them over the edge, where you were going to have too much of a good thing, if that makes any sense too. So I don't necessarily think those numbers historically are what we need to shoot for today, but they do give you a benchmark to kind of look at, where things were back then.
I would say too, in the adaptive Corgonian restoration framework that the CLC approved, and one of those sort of planning elements is a threats assessment. And you provided some quantitative evidence that can be used should, a threats assessment occur for, in any of these two populations. So that's another value, I think, of the work you share today.
This is Frank Chris. May I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Randy makes a good point about natural selection, but until you get eggs from Saginaw Bay, are you really going to have a chance to enforce that?
Yeah, I can follow up to that, Frank. The point I think I'm trying to make is the Cisco of today have adapted to all of the changes that have occurred in the lakes over the course of many decades, right? So whether it's the remnant stocks in Lake Huron or Lake Michigan, they've adapted to smelt, alewife, exotic prey, spiny water fleas. I mean, you name all these changes. And so, that was one of the arguments for Lake Huron to use in-lake gametes, because the hope is that whatever adaptation or selection pressures that have occurred, we're going to be maximizing that by using in-lake populations in the restoration effort. So I guess we're hedging our bets that those selective pressures are important. Although again, genetically, we don't really have the linkages between, the different adaptive traits from a genetic standpoint to a form to an actual function in the lake. But that was part of the thinking behind it. So yeah, we're not expecting the eggs or the spring or fall fingerlings to adapt to outer Saginaw Bay. Well, we're hedging our bets is that the northern Lake Huron fish are most adapted to Lake Huron, therefore using them as a source of rehabilitation or restoration in outer Saginaw Bay made the most sense from a management standpoint.
Problem with that is both Green Bay and Saginaw Bay, as we know, are extremely eutrophic compared to at least the open waters. And hopefully we can get enough fish coming back from Saginaw Bay that you can actually get eggs from them someday.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Good question.
Well, and I'll add, going through the historical literature, these things spawn just about everywhere throughout Green Bay, on the outside edges, throughout Saginaw Bay, on the outside edges. I mean, there are some areas where they were concentrated more than others, but I mean, I certainly wouldn't think that eutrophication and hypoxia would, be an absolute preventer to reestablishing these populations. I mean, they should be able to find some areas. If you put enough fish in the system, they'll make it work. Hopefully.
And the outer bay of Saginaw Bay is actually a lot more like out offshore Lake Huron than people might think. It's really only the very inner bay that I think still has some hypoxia issues. And so I do think there's promise. Thanks, Titus. You didn't know what you made in that tongue-in-cheek comment.
Oh, I think he did.
Yeah, you think? All right. Any final questions? We appreciate so many of you hanging on. I think, Ben, we had over 80 people in your talk and still almost 60 hanging on here for the questions and discussion. So thanks to everybody for joining us on a Friday. If you can figure out your emojis and give Ben a sort of virtual round of applause, that would be excellent. And we hope to see you again in October, where we'll be hearing about the potential of another sort of new threat that wasn't a factor when the lakes were super productive. But now that the lakes are more clear, ultraviolet radiation can be penetrating much deeper. And Nikki will tell us if they are having any impact at all on whitefishes and Ciscos and bloater. So hope to see you all next month. Thanks again, Ben.
Sticking it out, everyone.